Hi, I just wanted to record a video and talk a little bit about how you might go from generating ideas for your report to beginning to organize that into a rough draft. Um, so this is just kind of a sample of what you guys might do. You certainly don't have to do it exactly the way I did, but this might be a way to kind of get something down on paper so that you're not kind of scrambling trying to figure out how to talk about your research. So, what you might do is start by just putting your research question at the very top of your page so that you always have in mind what it is you're trying to investigate. So let's just say, this is a sample research question. Does technology make people feel more alone? Let's say I wanted to research that and see if I can find an answer to that question. So let's assume that I've already asked this question and I've gone to library databases and I found a few good articles that I want to use on this topic. What I would say is that a lot of people assume, well, I better find articles that say the same thing, or else it's going to seem like my paper's all over the place. But actually, that's really not a good thing to do for a couple of reasons. One, if you're only actively looking for articles that all agree with each other, it would seem like you're kind of skewing the evidence, right? You're leaving out stuff that might contradict that evidence and might be valid, right? So again, take the articles that you find. Don't actively go seeking out, the answers that you think you should get, right? The other thing is, if you find 3 articles that are all saying identical stuff, you may run out of things to talk about in your paper. And what's going to make the paper more interesting as a report are these subtle or very different pieces of evidence that these articles discuss, right? So, that's just something to think about when you're actively looking for articles for your report essay. So let's say I've found 3 good articles. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I wouldn't only find 3 articles. I would, when you're searching, try to find maybe 4 or 5, just in case one of these articles that you think is pretty good doesn't turn out to be as good as you thought. And I should say later on in this activity, I talk a lot more about how to find good articles. So just know that that's coming up here. But once I've found the articles that I want to use for my paper, and I've narrowed it down to 3, then what I might do is for each article, read it carefully and go through and start taking notes. So I here kind of gave you a sample of, how you might start taking notes, but, it doesn't have to be limited to like 3 interesting points from each article. You could take like a whole page of notes on each article and then kind of go back and decide, while all this stuff is interesting, I'm only going to include these, 3 or 4 pieces of evidence in my paper. So, like the analysis essay, there has to be evidence in this paper. So that's going to be in the form of quotations, facts and statistics, all that stuff counts as evidence, right? So that's it. Go through each of the articles and start jotting down those things that you want to remember and that you want to come back to when you're actually writing your paper. It might be a good idea to kind of either jot down the page number where this piece of evidence you want to include comes from, or the paragraph number, just so you can go back and find it easily, right? So again, just as an example, like in the first article, let's say the first point that I want to bring up is on page 7. I might make a note of that here just so that I can find it easily when I go back to it. So that's it. Go through each of the articles, start to identify these things that you think would be good to include in your paper. Let me scroll down here for a second. So then, once you've kind of taken notes on each article, then you want to start to think about what are the similarities and differences between those articles. Because in a sense, really what this report is doing is comparing and contrasting what you find in these different articles to kind of try to get a more complete picture of the answer to this question. So, you might just start, again, thinking about how you might organize this. In your first body paragraph, you might only talk about what's going on in Article 1. Like, here's what it says, here's some evidence from it. And I guess I should say, it doesn't even have to be just one paragraph. It could be a section. You might do like a couple or a few paragraphs just talking about what Article 1 says to help answer this question of, does technology make people feel more alone? So then, eventually I want to shift and create a new section where I talk about the second article. But as I'm kind of summarizing and, giving evidence from Article 2, I also want to talk about how it compares and contrasts to Article number 1, right? So if I bring up some point, I might say, this is similar to what Smith talks about in Article 1, blah, 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 blah. Or this is completely the opposite of what Smith says back in Article 1, right? So that's it. As you go, you're kind of talking about how the articles relate to each other, how different they are or how similar that they are. And what I would suggest is the articles that are most different from each other, maybe put them furthest apart in your paper. So in other words, if Article 1 says one thing, Article 2 is kind of in the middle between Articles 1 and 3, and then Article 3 is really different from Article 1, it might make sense to put Article 3 at the end since it's the furthest away from Article 1, if you know what I'm saying. So again, you might just take some notes about like how each of these articles compares and contrasts with the others. Because again, what you want is for this to sound like a cohesive paper or report, not just, a couple paragraphs on 3 separate articles. It should all be fitting together and trying to help answer this research question that you've come up with, okay? So again, these are kind of just notes that you would take before you even start thinking about turning this into a draft. So then, like once you've gone through all 3 articles, thought about how they sort of relate to each other, then I try to answer this question. Based on the evidence, what conclusions can you draw about the answer to the research question? And realistically, you've only looked really closely at 3 articles. That's probably not enough evidence to make a very conclusive statement, but based on these 3 articles that you looked at, what would you say the answer to this question is that you posed? So going with this sample topic that I came up with, and I should say I didn't actually look at articles on this question, so I'm kind of making this up, but maybe what I would find is it seems that while technology makes people feel connected on the surface, these connections are only superficial and ultimately leave people feeling alone unless they're obsessively using technology. So again, maybe all 3 of these articles have different ideas about this. If that's true, that's what you could say. You could say, it seems like the research is divided on this question. Some people think this, other people think this. That's totally valid. Because remember, all you're doing is reporting what you found. That's the purpose of this paper. It's not you giving your own opinion on this. It's not you arguing for or against the research that you find. It's simply reporting, here's what these things said. And based on what I found, here's what I think that means. Okay? So again, like if maybe a couple of the articles are pretty similar and one's very different, you could express that too. Say something like, while some research suggests that, technology is not the primary cause of people's loneliness, most researchers find that it does play a significant role, right? So that's it. Just depends on these articles that you find and how similar or different they are, what that conclusion you're going to draw is. So just like a very simple breakdown of what each of these sections of the paper is going to do. I mean, you're going to see in the learning activity here a more specific breakdown of this. But essentially in your intro, what you should be doing is explaining why the subject that you're going to discuss is interesting. So in other words, why does this matter if technology makes people feel alone, right? What are the consequences of that? Or what's at stake, right? Also you could discuss like what's debatable or controversial about this, right? I think that some people think that technology is great in that it allows for a lot of connection with people all over the world, but other people think it's kind of dangerous because we do see a lot of depression and anxiety these days, and that seems to have risen with the use of the internet, right? Also in the intro, sort of like the analysis, you want to kind of give a brief summary of what your research has said, right? So I might just give a couple or a few sentences saying, researchers are divided on the extent to which technology makes people feel alone. Some think that it doesn't have as much of an effect as people make it out to be, and others say that technology is really problematic when it comes to loneliness. So again, just sort of sum up what you're going to talk about in more depth later in the essay. And then you're going to lead up to your thesis, where you kind of say, based on my research, here's what the answer to this question is, right? So again, I think the most important thing is that the thesis should provide the answer to that question that you raised. And again, you might even mention in the introduction what that research question is, what it is you tried to find out by doing this report, okay? So in the body sections, like I mentioned earlier, I would say do a section, not just one paragraph, but a section on each article that you found and discuss how the findings compare to the other articles. So like I mentioned earlier, I would think the body section should at least be broken up into 3 sections. Section on Article 1, section on Article 2, and section on Article 3. But again, you want to make sure to talk about how each of these articles compare or contrast with the others. So in other words, section 2 on Article 2 should not be exclusively on Article 2. It should probably talk about stuff that you discussed with Article 1 as well, right? This is similar to Article 1 or this is different from Article 1. Do the same thing in your 3rd section. Like here's how this is different from Article 1 and 2, or here's how it's similar, right? Again, doing this is going to help you get 5 pages. Discussing 3 articles, both summarizing them and talking about how they relate to each other, I think you should easily be able to get 5 pages if you do this. So then in your conclusion, you want to restate sort of what conclusions you were able to draw from your research. So based on what I found, here's what seems to be the answer to this question. But maybe even more importantly, talk about why it matters. How will answering this question benefit someone, right? Why does it matter if we know that technology leads to loneliness? Maybe it'll cause us to be more cautious with how we use technology. Maybe especially with kids, we'll limit their exposure. Maybe this can help us prevent serious problems like depression or even suicide. So again, I think always in a conclusion, that's the place to talk about why this information you're providing is worthwhile to the audience. Okay, so hopefully this helps you as you're getting started, but I think if you read the rest of what's in this learning activity, it'll give you even more specifics about how to start organizing this report essay.